So Professor Murillo is assistant professor in the departments of Gender, Women's, and Sexuality Studies, History, and Latinx Studies at the University of Iowa. She is completing her first book titled Fighting for Control, Power, Reproductive Care, and Race in the U.S.-Mexico Borderlands, forthcoming with UNC Press later this year. Her writing appears in the Washington Post, Rewire News, Nursing Clio, and Notches. Her last academic article, Esponta Cigüeñas, Race and Abortion in the U.S.-Mexico Borderlands, won the 2023 Catherine Stimson Prize for Outstanding Feminist Scholarship in Signs, a Journal of Women and Culture and Society. Her research is supported by several grants and fellowships, including from the American Association of University Women, the American Council of Learned Societies, and the Ford Foundation. And Lina also co-directs the Maternal Health and Reproductive Politics Obermann Collaborative at the University of Iowa. And I would just say it's a real honor. So Lina and I go way back, but it's really been a pleasure for me as part of the steering committee to, I think, hopefully broaden our horizons in terms of the types of scholarship we engage in when it comes to really critical issues of things like reproductive care and feminist issues. And so I look forward to this being hopefully part of an opening wedge for broader exploration of these critical themes.
Thank you. So thank you so much to my dear friend, Dr. Simon Balto, for inviting me to give this talk today. This is a very generous invitation. I'm very excited to share what is part of my second project on abortion and reproduction. So my first book, as Simon says, coming out at the end of the year. And so this is new work that I'm doing. So I'm very excited to be in conversation with all of you today about this and to hear your thoughts. I also very much want to thank the Higgins Wright Center for Social Justice for bringing me to campus, and my greatest and deepest gratitude goes to Adrian Paget for being so wonderful in organizing this trip and having a fabulous breakfast with me this morning. And we talked all things reproductive justice and abortion and white supremacy, which is part of my talk today. So I'm going to be talking about the history of abortion and demographic fears focused on the Midwest. And I want us to look at the image on the screen right now. It's from a film, a Danish-American film that came out in 1972 called ZPG, Zero Population Growth. And just hold that in your minds. As you can see at the very top, it says, smog covers the earth. The oxygen is depleted. Love is encouraged, but the penalty for earth is death. Not dramatic at all, right? The time is tomorrow and there is no time left. So just keep that kind of dramatic energy in you as we take this kind of ride with me today. If that sort of foreclosing of the future feels somewhat similar, I feel like some of us feel like that in this room in politics and maybe the 2024 election. But I digress. Pete, if you don't mind going to the second slide. Thank you. So here's my history moment. In July 1969, Robert West, professor of chemistry at the University of Madison, Wisconsin, wrote to his colleague, Garrett Hardin, professor of biology at the University of California, Santa Barbara, asking about abortion. Professor West had concluded that something urgent needed to be done about the problem of overpopulation likely to cripple the planet and its inhabitants in the coming decade. West wrote, quote, even if the famine which looms over much of the world can be avoided, and I do not think it can, the exponential increase in numbers will, I believe, profoundly change human society, he said. After reading Hardin's recently published book, Population, Evolution, and Birth Control, West reasoned that there might be a way out of this man-made catastrophe. West explained that, quote, a change in attitude toward abortion is crucial, for with present technology, it seems that population stabilization cannot be achieved without the use of abortion to back up other methods of birth control, he said. Professor Garrett Harding certainly agreed with West's perspective on the issue of abortion and population control. Hardin had spent the better part of the 1960s writing openly about the need to liberalize abortion laws across the country as one of the most important pillars in the fight for, quote, population stabilization. Hardin's article, The Tragedy of the Commons, became a critical text in extending Thomas Malthus's thesis that exponential population growth was untenable on a planet whose natural resources would soon be depleted. If you don't mind, screen. Hardin and West were part of a longer lineage of academic scientists' growing concern since at least the 1950s, and I argue that there's activists that are concerned about overpopulation in the 1920s and 1930s, and they're worried about a world population out of control. As you can see, this is a Time magazine cover from 1960, right? And the images are mostly women in the global South with children. The late 1960s, however, saw a marked upswing in calls by many scientists demanding that the greater public take this issue seriously. Paul Ehrlich's now infamous The Population Bomb, along with Hardin's Tragedy of the Commons, were both published in 1968. By the 1970s, the country was enveloped in combating what seemed like the most pressing issue of their time, overpopulation. And many believed that the surest solution to what Robert West called, quote, the most important long-range issue facing humanity was an expansion of birth control options, including abortion access. So myself, a scholar of reproductive justice and a historian of abortion and contraception, and most recently, my focus has been on the U.S.-Mexico Borderlands. These connections between anxieties about population control and overpopulation and birth control for me are not new. This is especially true for the history of contraception. In fact, many women's historians, including people like Linda Gordon, have focused on the long history of family planning, and many have chronicled the life of Margaret Sanger and the establishment of Planned Parenthood, Federation of America, and they will often concede that the movement has had a long and troubled history with advocates for population control and with eugenicists being involved, right? Sometimes these eugenicists and population control people were one and the same. However, the history of abortion at the intersections of eugenics, population control, and demographic politics has not followed a similar introspective trajectory. And I'm happy to sort of dig into why that is during the Q&A session. I'm looking at you, Supreme Court, but we can talk about this further. But for now, allow me to walk you through what kind of brought me to think about this topic in the Midwest, because the Midwest has lots to say about this. Peter, if you don't mind the next one, thank you. So I'm going to and I'm sorry, I'm going to switch us from Wisconsin really quick to Iowa. But I'll bring us back to the Badger/Chief State. I didn't know which one to go with. Simon, you can tell me what I'm doing. I'm originally from California, so I'm going to be real messy with my knowledge of the Midwest, but I'm going to try, and I hope that my Midwest friends will tell me if I'm going the right direction. So when Roe fell in 2022, I mean, and we sort of knew, right? We had the kind of brief moment with the thing that was released in like April, right? Where the memo, thank you, the memo that was released. And so people were like, uh-oh, is this really happening? And then it finally does fall June 2022. And everyone's sort of rushing to figure out, well, what is going on? What does this mean? And so I was getting a lot of calls to talk about it in Iowa. And so IPR was like, help us figure this out. And I was like, well, I am a historian of the Borderlands. I don't know anything about Iowa, but I'm a researcher and a historian. So let me find out. And I did some digging, and seems that the only person that's ever really written about the history of abortion in Iowa is a man by the name James Moore. And he's a very famous historian of abortion, wrote a great book called Abortion in the 19th Century. And this is like in the late 1970s. And in 1981 or 82, he publishes this article on the history of abortion in the Annals of Iowa. And he concludes that there's a lot of conversation in the Iowa state legislature in the late, like starting in 1968, and it really ramps up 69, 70, 71, 72, talking about liberalizing the state abortion laws. And he says that the reason why people are concerned about this is because of overpopulation. He's like, sure, there's other things going on. There's physicians who are like, maybe we don't want to be criminalized for offering people abortions anymore. We as physicians need to kind of come together and fight these really oppressive laws. That's one sort of interest group. Then they're like the women's movement. Sure, they're like, we'd like to be able to have some control over our bodies. That'd be great. But he's like, really what it comes down to when I look at the sources, and he sits with the sources of legislators who donated their papers to the Iowa, the special collections at the University of Iowa. He's like, the majority of constituents writing into these legislators are like, we need to do something about overpopulation. This is a massive problem. Let me step it back even a little bit further. So I'm like thinking about this, and I'm like, oh my God, this is so fascinating. And then I'm starting to think about what else is going on in the 1960s. What else could be informing this? And sure, and he's right. So physicians are like upset because now they're starting to be criminalized in ways that they hadn't been. This is not to say that because we didn't have Roe v. Wade until 1973, it doesn't mean that before then there was no access to abortion. Abortion, for everyone out there, it's always existed. It's always been a thing. It's been underground, right? When it was illegal, it was underground, but it still existed, always has, always will. It is a part of people's reproductive health care. It's a fundamental part of healthcare. It will always exist. You cannot legislate it away, but you can legislate it to be more dangerous, right? And we know this from before Roe. So that was one of the critiques, right? Women are dying because they're going to quote unquote back alley butchers. And so we need to, roll back some of these crippling laws. There was also the issue with thalidomide in the 1960s, where women to sort of deal with morning sickness and things, women were given this horrible drug, and it was producing horrible fetal abnormalities. And so there was like Shelley Fishbein, who's like a famous like kid morning show host. She had, I think she was like on her third or fourth pregnancy, and she was given thalidomide. And she was like, I'd like to have an abortion because there's like a 90% chance my child has all these may not survive. And the government in the United States is like, no, so she flies to Europe. So this was like national news, right? So these kinds of conversations are informing how people are understanding the need to liberalize abortion in the 1960s. And there's population control, right? Like that is actually a really big concern for people. And so as you can see, I'm giving you this, this is a poll that was done in 1970, the Des Moines Register in Iowa. And they took a poll and they surveyed residents across the state of Iowa, confirming for them that overpopulation was the greatest fear as this new decade began. 3/4 of adults in Iowa, quote, worried about the possibility that the world population might double in the next 40 years. A majority of Iowans believe that family planning, education, and birth control were key to averting global catastrophe. Iowans were not singular in their concerns about overpopulation. Other states in the region, including Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, were similarly vexed by the issue of what to do about overpopulation. Now, again, I said I'm a Californian, so I'm looking at this stuff and I'm like, why are people in the most rural state freaking out about overpopulation? This makes no sense to me. As a you say, make it make sense. Why is there such a fixation by people in Iowa on overpopulation in a historically rural state that doesn't seem to add up. In fact, recent legislation of demographic data in Iowa concludes that, quote, Iowa has long been a slow-growing state. While the U.S. population more than doubled between 1950 and 1910, Iowa's population grew by a minuscule 16%, right? And in fact, what we're seeing right now, and we were actually talking about this with Adrian, is that there's a massive depopulation of the state, right? There's what they call the brain drain. People are actually fleeing. Shocker. Why would they flee from Iowa? Nobody knows. We can also talk about that in the Q&A. So as I began to dig through the James Moore kind of archive, and really, this is kind of like what historians do sometimes. You find an old article and you're like, what are these people looking at? Let me look through their archives. And so I did. I started to look through some of the papers of these state legislators. And I noticed that those who opposed, so there was two camps, right? The ones that were in favor of abortion and the ones that were against. And those who opposed abortion liberalization in Iowa, they even acknowledged, right, fears about overpopulation as they simultaneously touted the growing loss of, quote, Christian values and moral decay that would surely besiege their state if abortion laws became less restrictive. As debate over abortion heated up in Iowa beginning in 1969, constituents wrote hundreds of letters to their legislators declaring these concerns. One Des Moines resident explained, quote, we can talk about overpopulation and other ills, but to correct one wrong with another, liberalizing abortion laws, is idiotic, they said. Another resident, this time from Waterloo, Iowa, wrote, what happens to the morals of a country when a person can decide if he is to kill an unborn baby or not? What happened in Russia or in Sweden? They love the like communism, right? It's always there. And a couple, right? And so oftentimes, especially folks who were against liberalizing, but they would write, husband or wife would write together. So a Black Hawk County couple pleaded with legislators to, quote, in the consciences of motherhood, these are all in bold, Americanism and humanism, vote no to loosening abortion laws in Iowa. In attempts to halt further discussions about abortion access, Iowa residents evoked this new holy trinity of motherhood, Americanism, and humanism in the name of protecting Iowa's morals and values from the decadent path taken by so-called communist and socialist countries. So connecting seemingly disjointed concerns for demographic change, nationalism, motherhood, anti-communism, and the preservation of fetal life against liberalizing abortion in Iowa were part of still a nascent, right? This is still a nascent anti-abortion movement that would come to flourish in the decades after Roe. So it's not like there weren't anti-abortion organizer thinkers before, but it becomes stronger after Roe. And my dear friends and historians, Carissa Hageberg and Jennifer Holland, suggest in their research on pro-life activists, they've written great books, which I highly recommend. These disparate messages were part and parcel of ideas deeply connected to white supremacists, machinations about the preservation of white life, beginning at conception, and I would argue in this essay, the preservation of white space and place, best immortalized in America's heartland. So by unspooling these historical threads that unite major changes in reproductive rights laws, we begin to understand how attitudes about the politics of demographic and population changes swelled white anxieties around American morality and culture. Demographic changes have, since at least the 19th century, produced anxieties about the racial composition of the United States that pulled at cultural ideas undergirding white nationalism. Values uplifting frugality, hard work, responsibility, individuality, reason, respect, liberty, virility, and its control have been critical ideological components of a white Christian male, right, vision of racial formation in the United States. As coastal and borderland states quickly began to see massive and seemingly unbridled demographic changes in the 20th century, the US's imagined heartland became the last great space to preserve values and ideals whites felt were under attack. Again, does this bill familiar? I hope it does. These anxieties became even more pronounced as the end of the civil rights era bled into the era of, quote, militant activism against the Vietnam War and for freedom struggles among Black, Latina, Latino, and Latina and Indigenous communities. A lot of that happening in the Midwest, right? As well as the women's movement. And I owe much of my thinking on this and thinking about sort of the significance of the Midwest to my beautiful and brilliant colleague, Ashley Howard, who's writing a wonderful book about violence and Black rebellion in the Midwest. And she and I spent a lot of time thinking about what is the significance of this place. And so in other words, what I'm saying is in overwhelmingly white states such as Iowa and Wisconsin, and just to give you an idea, census data from 1960 in Iowa, Iowa was 99% white. And in 1970 was 98% white. Wisconsin, sorry, y'all didn't fare much better. 1960, 97% white, and 96% white in 1970, right? I'm arguing that these abortion debates were driven on both sides of the spectrum, those in favor and against abortion liberalization. They're driven by this idea of white supremacy, right? And I really want to articulate that for the way that I'm understanding and writing about white supremacy is really the idea that one group reigns supreme in its ability, right? And it's really its moral charge to define a society. Right, to define the policies, rules, regulations, systems, structures that will benefit it, right, over the benefit of other communities, right, especially other communities of color. Oh, the next slide. So here I'm using Iowa again. I'm sorry, very Iowa-centric. I'll go back to Wisconsin. We will talk about Wisconsin for sure. So I use Iowa as a focal point for some of this analysis for several reasons. First, its location bordering several Midwestern states, including Nebraska, South Dakota, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, Missouri, places this state at the literal center of the so-called Heartland. And imagine white, bucolic, pristine, hardy, and bountiful Christian oasis at the very core of the American nation. Its picturesque farmscapes live effortlessly in the minds of most white Americans envisioning their homeland. Second, as James Moore article demonstrates, Iowans' deliberations over liberalizing abortion restrictions were perfectly preserved in the records of several state legislators. And one of them is Minette Doderer, Errol Willits, and then Willa Charlene Conklin. And their stories are really interesting. I hope to write more about these people. And in these archives, right, you see people offering justifications for allowing abortion restrictions to remain as they are, or overturning them completely. And this becomes, for me, a sort of window into the heart and soul of white Americans wrestling with differing definitions and visions of white supremacy, right? They're like, we need to be in charge, but how? What are these sort of different ways that we seek to remain in charge? Should white supremacy concern itself with clamping down on a global, quote, mostly Black and brown population run amok, one that might eventually make its way to the heartland? Or should Iowans discipline and control their own fertility as an example to others incapable of doing so? Or should white supremacy focus on protecting the moral fiber of America, life, liberty, property, and virility? These were not necessarily, what I'm arguing, oppositional concerns. Rather, in the debate about abortion, they helped to shape opposing viewpoints in the sort of overall fight for a white supremacist vision in the Midwest. And finally, Iowa's demographic reality could not have created a starker contrast to its residents' fears. Both its racial composition and population density did not and still do not warrant the level of racial anxiety and animus created by the population explosion scares and abortion disputes of the 1960s. And yet, they were freaked out. In the spring of 1969, Iowa's Press Citizen dedicated nearly all of its editorial page to the question of overpopulation, with the headline blaring, "How fast is the world growing? 72 million people yearly." Several articles accompanied the central focus on this page, which was overpopulation. And there were other articles around it. One was about the war in Vietnam, and another was titled, quote, "The New Face of Black Power." The juxtapositioning of these other issues elevated and added gravitas to the overpopulation debate happening on the page. The massive image that complemented these other news stories provided visual guidance to those on both sides of the abortion debate. Alarming to those worried about overpopulation were certainly the numerical figures and regional diagrams depicted in the image that you see on screen. The map revealed that nearby Central America held the fastest growing population in the world, with Costa Rica leading the pack. And in the following years, ground zero actually becomes Mexico. So international population control movements are like, actually, Mexico is the worst offender of unbridled fertility, and we need to do something to stop it. And I'm writing about that currently. Immigration fears and concerns of, quote, hordes of Latin Americans spilling across the U.S.-Mexico border had been a consistent concern for white Americans since at least the turn of the 20th century. Overall, the largest contributors to the overpopulation problem, those having the most babies, were in the global South, Africa, Asia, and Latin America, continents considered to house all of the world's developing nations. The Press Citizen's editors cited University of Iowa entomologist Hugh Dingell's main issue that, quote, "Millions die now in the world of causes related to starvation." And that, quote, "What is occurring now is that temporary expedients to ease the problem of starvation are only producing more people to starve later." Dingell estimated that easing poverty via food programs to those in the so-called third world was backfiring on the first world. Rather than aid emerging nations during the post-colonial period, after Europe and the United States had bankrolled industrialization, the first world, through the exploitation and expropriation of their land and labor, the developed world was in danger of being overcome by explosive third world populations. The editors concluded that the doubling of the world's population would undoubtedly double, quote, "human suffering around the globe." Peter, next, thank you. So you guys are back, Madison. Same thing, right? Danger of overpopulation stirs interest in birth control. Similar articles ran in Wisconsin newspapers that foresaw an overpopulation apocalypse. For instance, so there's this one in the Capital Times, but one that I thought was fascinating, another article that I found in the Green Bay Press Gazette. Editors believed it was critical to write about the overpopulation problem in the Philippines and other Asian countries, explaining to the readership of one of Wisconsin's northernmost regions that the combination of overpopulation and underemployment were serious problems that faced Asia. These were international important problems that people in Green Bay should be afraid of. And they said, quote, "Manila, the capital of the Philippines, stood out to the editors as quote, an example of chaos of its crowds," right? All this fear. These kinds of sensationalist articles surely influenced the thinking of many of these rural and out of the way Midwestern cities and towns as they grappled with the potential social unrest among the so-called colored masses at home, while imagining the burgeoning so-called color masses abroad, right? Next one, thank you. In Iowa, I'm sorry, this is very brusque, going back and forth, but in Iowa, many residents agreed with these media representations, and it's clear that these media representations influenced how they thought about these things. Supporters of liberalizing abortion restrictions sent countless letters to legislators connecting greater abortion access to ending overpopulation. Several Cedar Falls residents wrote in a telegram, quote, "No one can argue that we don't have enough unwanted babies. Let us do now what we humanely can to reduce the present oversupply. We urge you to vote yes on the abortion bill and thus do your part to reduce the misery and unhappiness in today's world, close quote. Another Cedar Falls couple expressed a similar sentiment, and that's the Western Union Telegram you see above, quote, we believe that our society must realistically acknowledge and act on population control measures to maintain a free and healthy society. We urge you to support prompt passage of the bill to liberalize Iowa abortion laws. We should provide an opportunity for children not to be born into unwanted environments, close quote. By the following year, some legislators expressed agreement with their constituents as they lean into the varied arguments in favor of greater abortion access. Earl M. Willits, Democrat from Polk County in the Iowa House, replied to a voter's inquiry about the proposed abortion liberalization legislation, quote, this seems to me the wise step to take at this time in light of the problems we face with unwanted children, women seeking illegal abortion, and of course, overpopulation. Claims that there existed an, quote, oversupply of babies hearken to the discourses about the supposed hyperfertility among women of color the world over and the deep need for expanding family planning campaigns, including access to abortion and forced sterilization. And in fact, it's in these years, in the late 1960s and into the 1970s, that it's discovered that hundreds of Mexican origin women have been sterilized against their consent in Los Angeles, right? And there's a huge lawsuit. And then sort of eugenic boards around the country begin to sort of grapple with this horrific reproductive injustice. So remember that first slide for ZPG. Here they are, and they're in the heartland, and they're making moves. So national organizations for population control played a major role in framing the abortion debate in states like Iowa and Wisconsin around population control. Zero population growth, or ZPG, gained traction with Midwest residents. In Iowa, local chapters appeared in Johnson, Polk, and Block counties. In Wisconsin, ZPG appeared in various cities, including Stevens Point, Eau Claire. I'm going to get this next one wrong. Wausau?
Wausau.
Oh, Wausau. Okay, I did it. I practiced. La Crosse and Madison. ZPG was the brainchild of Paul Ehrlich, the Stanford biologist who had won acclaim and captured the world with his dire warnings of an impending civilization collapse due to unmitigated reproduction. There he is in the center. The leader, and he's still alive, by the way, the leader of the Iowa City Johnson County chapter of ZPG stated that they had received hundreds of inquiries from residents interested in joining their 25-member group. In Cedar Falls, Iowa, the local coordinator of the ZPG chapter, Dr. Daryl Hoff, professor of earth sciences, declared that, quote, the threat of overpopulation has not gone away during this first year of our group's existence. The ZPG provided important framing for the movement for population control in Iowa, offering key policy points, such as supporting, quote, birth control programs for all citizens, increased contraceptive research, new abortion laws, wider roles for women, and tax laws to encourage rather than discourage smaller families. In Stevens Point, Wisconsin, the connections between population control and abortion were clear. And you can see the clipping on the right-hand side. That's from the Stevens Point newspaper. In 1969, they advertised a talk by Dr. George Becker of the biology department, advertising a lecture on abortion and the American female. Hear about this highly controversial subject. And it's fascinating because historians have written about ZPG, including Matthew Connolly, who wrote a massive book called Fatal Misconception. And he writes of ZPG, quote, the national organization believed that, quote, population control begins at home, right? And we can determine what we mean by home. And among its adherents were those who believed that the U.S. should install a penal code that, quote, called for the sterilization of parents with more than 5 children. Some in the family planning movement, like Dr. Alan Guttmacher, who's a very well-respected, who also had his, he's an interesting character. I hope to write about him more. He appears in some of these letters from some of these eugenic folks. But he criticized ZPG, and he had been the president of Planned Parenthood Federation of America. And he suggested that organizations like ZPG were, quote, a smokescreen for something else, including white supremacy and anti-communism. And ZPG, this notion of zero population growth discourse makes its way into the special elections for the state of Wisconsin in 1969. As candidates were asked to weigh in on important issues for the state, would-be Senator David Fries from Watertown, Wisconsin, answered a question about pollution this way, quote, above all, we should recognize that pollution in the main is caused by having too many people in Wisconsin, in America, in the world. Therefore, we should strive immediately to accomplish zero population growth. In other words, educational programs and, if necessary, economic inducements should be resorted to so that people will understand that they have absolute responsibility to society to restrict the size of their families and prevent population growth. In Iowa, while legislators continue to discuss the politics of liberalizing abortion laws, these became sort of moot. Right? By 1973, this became irrelevant as the United States Supreme Court decided on a case that had originally come out of Texas, right? Jane Roe versus Wade County, which becomes Roe v. Wade, in effect liberalizing all abortion laws across the United States. I am not exactly sure what kinds of conversations legislators were having in Wisconsin, but I hope to come back and do lots of research on that, because I am sure that we will find very interesting things in discussions among papers of many of those legislators who might have been in favor of liberalizing abortion laws. They're similar to what I have found in Iowa, but maybe not. I look forward to doing that kind of analysis. But it's clear that they did not pass any laws before Roe v. Wade, right? So Roe is what allows Wisconsin to have access to abortion. Next slide. So what happens with our good friend Robert West, who is a professor here at the University of Madison, Wisconsin? He becomes a co-founder of Wisconsin's first abortion fund, the Women's Medical Fund. In her book, Abortion is a Blessing, Wisconsin women's activist Ann Nicole Gaylor explained how Wisconsin's first abortion fund came to be formed. Quote, prior to the Roe v. Wade decision, Professor Robert West of the University of Wisconsin Chemistry Department, his wife Peggy and I were discussing a particularly sad situation where a very young, disadvantaged woman needed to go to New York for an abortion. We should start a fund, Bob said, to help some of these women. Oh, Bob, I replied, that fund would always be running out of money. But we'd help some, he persisted. And so in 1972, the Women's Medical Fund was born and incorporated. And over the last few years, and she wrote this book, it was originally published in 1975. And so I'm sure thousands more women have been supported with it. But at the time, about 5,000 women had been supported with this abortion fund. And it's true, many abortion funds that exist around the country precede Roe, right? The one in Iowa that I've worked with was started through the Clergy Consultation Service, which was an organization of mostly Protestant and Jewish clergy who sought to help their parishioners see clandestine abortion providers, right? However, less discussed is the fact, and especially among historians of abortion reproduction, are the sort of deep-rooted histories of population control fears that motivated the politics around the liberalization of abortion laws and the creation of organizations like the Women's Medical Fund, right? In fact, before Nicole Gaylor starts the Women's Medical Fund, she starts the chapter of ZPG in Madison, right? So she's one of the founders of that.
Mm.
So although anti-abortion activists bring up population control and eugenics all the time as a means to discredit the movement for reproductive freedom, and again, including the Supreme Court, Clarence Thomas, I'm talking to you, historians insist on downplaying these connections. I think that is a mistake. It's time to say that's a mistake. I believe we need to write much more grounded histories, especially examining particular regions of the country and specific localities to understand how people were talking and thinking about abortion, demographic change, and population control as part of a singular narrative, right? That's how they were thinking about these things. And we need to understand how and why. Omitting these troubling histories does nothing to protect our rights to bodily autonomy. We have no constitutional right to our bodies at this very moment. So like hiding these histories or not talking about them has done us no good, right? Has done us no good. We need to write critically about these histories. Not clearly and accurately discussing the politics of abortion and the intersections of demography and white supremacy in the United States has had major repercussions in the movements for reproductive liberation, namely that it has alienated communities of color who have experienced nefarious attacks on their bodies, namely through forced sterilizations, and also at times pushing women into having abortions. And here I would highly recommend the work of Alondra Nelson, who writes about the Black Panther Party in New York and the kinds of abuses that Black women and other women of color, Puerto Rican women, suffered in the public health system. Oftentimes, especially after Roe, women were, and New York liberalizes its abortion laws before then, right? And so she's written about this, how some women, poor women, were like coming into the hospital to ask for prenatal care, ask for just health care with their pregnancies. And they were like, do you not want an abortion? And they would say like, no, I want to have my baby, right? And that is critical to a reproductive justice framing of this history, right? Because reproductive justice says that we have a right to have children, not to have children, and parent the children that we want to have in safe and sustainable environments. And so when we think about this through a reproductive justice lens, those kinds of connections become critical, right? And I would also argue that we need to read more books on the history of sterilization, right? And they're starting to come out more, right? My dear colleague and friend, Natalie Fixmer-Oraiz book on sterilization abuses among Mexican origin women in California, going way back into the 1920s, right? Women who were sent to quote unquote detention centers or centers for the feeble-minded and who were systematically detained at huge numbers. One last slide, I'm gonna be quiet after this. And then of course, there's my dear friend Garrett Hardin, who Robert West is writing to in that first slide, right? So Robert West reaches out to Garrett Hardin, who's been writing about abortion throughout the 1960s. He is one of the co-founders of NARAL, right, which is the National Organization to Repeal Abortion Laws, and today is the leading abortion rights organization in the country. He's a group of, among a group of 3 men who established that organization. We have not written about that organization thoughtfully. We need to. Here he is. This is a quote from the Southern Poverty Law Center. He died in 2003. He was a biologist, a professor at UC Santa Barbara. He's one of the architects. I have a colleague, Miroslava Chavez Garcia, who wrote a great essay that just recently came out called The Architects of Hate, where he, along with some very wealthy financiers, are the architects of what we understand to be the far right's vision for immigration controls, right? So he was like, reproduction, immigration, these are 2 sides of the same coin. We need to talk about them. And he's just a raging xenophobe. And he, into the 1990s, is writing about needing to bring back eugenics, that eugenics has gotten a bad name, and that we need to talk about eugenics as a serious science, because how can you deny it? The reason I know so much about him, I spent 3 delightful weeks at UC Santa Barbara looking through his files. He kept every letter that was sent to him, and he kept copies of his own letters, thank goodness, for that kind of organization. But he has an entire page dedicated to him on the Southern Poverty Law Center. And they said of him, Hardin used the specter of environmental destruction and ethnic conflict to promote policies that can be fairly described as fascist. Thank you all so much, and I welcome conversation.
I really appreciate your work. I cite you a lot in my own work. I'm working on a research project right now with CORE, the Center for Reproductive Equity here on campus, and I'm working with two professors up at UW Superior, and we're looking at abortion legislation in Wisconsin. And then we're comparing it with like all these other Midwestern states. And the thing that we're finding, we're looking from like the early 2000s up until now, Democratic politicians don't really introduce any like legislation other than let's celebrate Reproductive Rights Week or, you know, whatever. But then Republican politicians are pushing very extreme abortion bans and just extreme legislation. But I'm wondering, like, I guess my question, before like Roe and everything, were they actually pushing, like Democrats pushing more like pro-abortion legislation, or after Roe? Because like now we're seeing after Dobbs, they're still not really pushing protections or anything like in these Midwestern states. So I'm wondering if like after Roe, they were just like, oh, it's Roe, we're good, or were they actually like pushing more things that were pro-abortion in Wisconsin and Iowa, if you saw that, or if it's similar to now, like they're just
It's very similar to now, I think. And yeah, I mean, people and activists will say that this was like a great disappointment, right? That people just, Roe happened and everyone just sort of, aside from activists on the ground, and especially I think in the 80s and 90s, when you begin to see actual violence, right? When you begin to see like bombings on abortion clinics, that there was like a little bit of stirring, but still not enough. So like the laws that are passed are actually like to protect the space, the abortion clinic space. But aside from that, yeah, there's nothing like really to talk critically about healthcare. And I think that like this is the thing that I need to stop being curious about things, but it's like the dangers of being like in these ways. You're like, this leads to this and this leads to that, but it really is a conversation about healthcare and about advocating plainly that reproductive health is also just healthcare, and access to abortion, access to birth control, access to prenatal care is just healthcare. And especially when you're asking and demanding these things for the people on the sort of lowest rungs of the economic ladder in the 80s, late 70s, 80s, and 90s, right? You have like the Reaganites, and you have this like harsh conservative backlash to the 70s. And a lot of that we haven't yet like thought through well, and I would say we as historians, I do not want to have other people in this space who are definitely doing that work, but like historians have not, and I really lean on the work of like Kathleen Bellow, who's like, I'm a historian of the present. That means that like 1980s is history, I'm doing it. Because I know some 19th century folks are like, if it's not 150 years old, we shouldn't care about it. We certainly have to care. Like our world is ramping up, time is ramping up really fast. But to your point, like, there is such a backlash to these tiny gains, really. And so to suggest anything more sweeping would be to get involved in like questions around welfare, questions around public health. And like a lot of these Democrats who are just like trying to toe the line, they just don't do anything, right? And yet still get elected by saying like, I've sought to preserve women's reproductive rights. And you're like, but have you though? But like, have you? Right. And so now all of a sudden, now that we don't have Roe, people are like, oh, what? It's like, what, yeah, what were you doing? Right. Like what was, you know, not to put Planned Parenthood on the spot, but like what was Planned Parenthood doing during that time? Like what did those what did all those lobbying get you? I think that in some ways the anti-abortion movement in some ways has been very, very savvy, and they have out-organized, right? They have out-organized us.
Yeah, they've had a plan, like, since the beginning, and they've kind of hit all their marks, and they're on the way to their goals.
And I don't know if y'all saw the recent, I mean, Simon was the one that sent it to me, the recent New York Times article where like, we can't wait until Trump gets into office. We have plans for your contraception, my people, right? Like, we have plans for all the things. And this is what I taught, in Iowa, I tell my students, I'm like, tell me what the vision is. We're gonna have no social safety net, but we are going to force you to birth. We have no OB-GYNs in the state of Iowa, right? Rural health care is absolutely in shambles. So what is your grand plan here to support people's families and their health? Like, what is it? Because they might have out-organized this, but that plan, right? I have an idea, is that part of it has to do with the fact that demographic changes are coming. And they see that the majority of people that are having children in Iowa are actually not white. And so they're like, we'll save some of those white children, but the majority of people having children are Latinos and Asian communities that are growing in large numbers in Iowa specifically. And they're like, the politics of death, essentially.
Thank you for that question.
Yeah, thank you.
I have multiple questions, but we also talk pretty much every day, so I defer to others.
So I have a question about like a comparison. So do you think the abortion right here in America, is it more about a cultural issue or more about economic issue? Like for my perspective, like in East Asia, abortion rights things are usually, and population is usually more concerned about like the economics, like you have to produce a large backup for the workforce, like to keep your population growth too, so you have more people to work in the factories, maintain the status as work factory, like in China today, and their last like strict Christian culture there. So it's not about cultural, it's more about economics. It's about the economic growth, be healthy. But I think it will be different here in America. So what do you think about the case of America?
I think it's really, part of like what I'm thinking about with this project is really, like I said, sort of competing visions for white supremacy and like how white supremacy is not a homogenous ideology, right? That there are different groups vying for like being able to be in control of that ideology. And so one I would put in the sort of Garrett Hardin faction, where they're not necessarily thinking about economics. They are thinking about things like Western civilization and the environment and preserving these things for their people, right? And so he is, very anti-immigration. But then I do think that there are other people who are like, we welcome immigration, but as second-class, third-class citizens, people that are just here to work the factories. I mean, again, not to bring up Iowa, but I will. That's essentially what's happening in Iowa, right? Where you have the majority of people that are coming in as migrants are there to work agricultural jobs or to work in meatpacking industries, right? And so, but at the same time, they're like, we're going to defund public education because we know your kids are going to need that. So like, we'll get rid of that. We will lower the working age. So your children, since they can't get an education, might as well just put those babies to work, right? So like, but again, it's fascinating to go state by state in a place like the United States. Now, yeah, I mean, I think that like, for instance, in China, and in Japan, they're having issues with depopulation, right? Where they're like, oh my gosh, we have this, in China, I've been in like Korea, South Korea is really interesting. Where they're having conversations about like, we put into place these population control measures, and now we have this aging population. Now we don't have people to take care of this aging population through taxes, right? So they are very much thinking about it through economic terms. But I think that in the United States, there's like competing visions for like how to think about this. And the same thing is happening here, right? There is a depopulating population going on, and I'm actually writing a different article that's looking at white nationalists concerns for what they call white genocide or the white birth that was coined in the late 1970s. So it's like there's different like demography and the way that people understand the politics of demography also are complicated through sort of various understandings of white supremacy. That's kind of how I would maybe address that question.
How would you interpret what former President Donald Trump said this week about abortion?
I try not to, I somehow I've gotten off of all of the social media. And so I don't know, what did he say this week about abortion?
He said he will to become president again, that he would try to have a national.
Oh, the national ban. Yeah.
I think 15, 16 weeks was the number he threw.
Just throw out these completely, haphazard dates to, I mean, I think it's absolutely frightening. Right? I think it's absolutely frightening. And the people that are thinking through these things, his quote unquote policy advisors, like I said, they're not just seeking to stop there, right? They're seeking to go deeper. And part of what we've already seen, this happened before the end of Roe, as various states were already curtailing various kinds of access to abortion, right? Determining at what weeks, right? All these heartbeat bills, all these various ways to curtail abortion that kind of led up to Roe, people are being criminalized, right? Women who are suspected of miscarrying are accused of having abortion. So I see, and I have a wonderful colleague at UCSF who's actually a sociologist who's writing about the intersections of the carceral state and reproductive justice, right? And so that we will begin to see and this has been a long time, sort of happening in incarcerated people, but their absolute denial of their ability to have children, right? Through forced sterilization is very common. Was a very common practice in California. I still think is, despite the fact that they have laws on the books that say you cannot do that to people. But I see that there's going to be a desire to criminalize people. And so a national ban is going to embolden and empower some of these more, the real zealots out there in some of our state legislatures to go further, right? Despite the fact that they say like, oh no, we're not seeking to criminalize women who have miscarriages or abortions. This is about, the doctors or whatever. We've actually seen that that's not true, right? So I do see that there's going to be this kind of connection between, deeper connection between incarcerating people and these kinds of national events. That's how I see that coming together frighteningly for us.
I mean, if I can jump in on that too. I mean, Trump is Trump, right? I mean, he's like, he doesn't have particular policy issues other than xenophobia and self-interest, right? And so,
But he puts the people in the Supreme Court.
of course, right? But I mean, so the article that Lina referenced earlier was about people who are literally in Trump's corner, who root for him to return to office, but don't actually want him to even know their plans for what they want to do with abortion. So what they're talking about is using the Comstock Act of 1873, so literally 100 years before Roe versus Wade, to criminalize abortion sort of blanketly across the country, in terms of like mailing out any information about abortion, criminalizing sending abortion pills through the mail, which is the most common form of abortion, right? I mean, so it's like, so Trump is he's a wedge for these even more extremist people when it comes to abortion issues. And so it's like, when he gets into office, like they literally, one of the people that was quoted in the article literally said, I hope Trump has never heard of the Comstock Act.
Jonathan
Because-
Mitchell.
Yeah, you're like, I know him.
And he said, he was like, I don't want him to utter the phrase Comstock Act on the campaign trail because I want this to be a total non-issue until he gets into office and then we go into action. So it's just like, you know, Trump is, I don't know, he's the Manchurian candidate, I suppose, on the issue.
Yeah, but fortunately, we've got some good historians who are writing briefs as we speak, who are thinking critically about the Comstock Act, because people are like, when Roe fell, people are like, oh my God, do we need to, do we need to revisit the Comstock Act, right? And it's not just abortion, it's birth control and anything that was deemed at the time lascivious material, right? So pornography, I mean, like anything, right? And this goes again in line with this sort of vision of like, you know, everyone who doesn't think like we do is a pedophile. Like all of this kind of, all of that world comes together with something like the Comstock Act. Actually, yeah. So,
Lina, my question is about what you found in regards to healthcare providers and medicine and how they are implicated, or what sort, how they were involved or not involved in these sorts of discussions around policy, around zero population control. You know, you mentioned, you know, Iowa being an incredibly rural state, and whether or not you have access to care or not. And I imagine, you know, Iowa in the 70s, you might have had a general practitioner who wasn't actually part of an HMO or something like that. So maybe big medicine wouldn't have had a stake in pursuing or pushing a certain kind of policy or not. So I'm curious, like, have you found anything as relates to, you know, as relates to medicine broadly as an institution? We know, you know, the founder of modern gynecology was a white supremacist,
Yeah.
right? And he's deeply implicated in how we understand the violence done to women's bodies since the beginning of that. So I'm just curious what you found so far.
So I found a lot of various conversations. So there are physicians who are writing, really, please just rescind these laws. You know, you really are sort of shackling us to these archaic laws that don't allow us to provide like accurate and thoughtful healthcare. And again, I'll lean on the work of James Moore, who's like, by this time, the medical sort of profession is firmly rooted. And so they're not vying like they were in the 19th century for control over healthcare. And they sort of choose, Horatio Storer is the person who sort of oversees the campaign against abortion in the 1850s and 1860s. And for him, it's about professionalization, but also other scholars are like, but it was also about sort of demographic change in the racial makeup. And so he says at one point, like, do we want, similar to Steve King of Iowa, do we want foreigners having American babies, essentially, right? So this is the 1850s. Again, lead up to the Civil War, like lots of these kinds of ideas. But by the 1960s and 1970s, physicians are like, look, we got this, and we need to be able to provide care. But there are physicians who are Catholic, right? So again, Midwest, fascinating Catholic, Protestant, but yes, lots of Catholics, and a lot of Catholic doctors are like, no, against this. Like, no, we actually don't. Like, because there's, and I'm trying to find it. There is a someone in the Indiana legislature, which is going to be fun. So look through, like does some data collecting to see how many women are actually dying of quote unquote back alley abortions. And they're like, not that many is what they're, and I'm like, well, what is not that many? Like one is too many, but okay. And they're like, it's only this much, right? I think, and I don't want to quote the number because I don't remember what it was. They're like, oh, we thought it was like hundreds of thousands, but it's only like, not that, like, they're like, oh, actually, it's only this many. And that kind of analysis that they do is published throughout newspapers in the Midwest. And Midwesterners are then like in Iowa and Wisconsin are like, hey, they did this thing, this like collection data thing in Indiana. Like, we need to do that here too. Do we actually need it? Like, how many people? Like, how many women? Is that? I mean, so I think that there's like, I don't want to say that all Christians were in favor of liberalizing abortion law. I think it's complicated. I think that they wanted to have more control. I also think that some of them did see some of their colleagues, like in Iowa, there's a elder physician who had been providing underground abortions for like 35 years. And all of a sudden in 1960, he gets arrested. People were like, what are you doing with like, Jeff or whatever? Like, leave Dr. Jeff alone. And people were shocked that they were arresting him because everyone in the community kind of knew that it was a service that he offered to like that broader part of the state, again, rural area. And it was kind of shocking for them to see this man who had been to them providing care. And so that kind of stuff begins to rattle physicians also, right? So there's like lots of stuff going on in the medical front that I would like to spend more time looking at, absolutely. Any questions? Oh, yeah.
So I guess I might have kind of two related questions. One is, it seems like you were looking at the rampage of these legislatures and you found these legislators, and you found a lot of people writing in about population and fears of overpopulation. And I wonder, is there a sector of the population that is afraid and a sector that isn't? Who is the group that writes in? And
Right.
the second question is that still there or did it go away? Are Iowans still worried about overpopulation, or are they more concerned about other things in the area?
So the question about like, who are these people writing in is really important. Sometimes people self-identify, like, especially like religious kind of affiliation. But other times it's, you don't know, right? Like you have no idea who some of these folks are. Sometimes you can, by their address or their locale, you can kind of gauge where, who they might be. And sometimes they talk about, like, I want to talk about this bill, but I also want to talk about, this is really fascinating. I also want to talk about more public support for Christian schools. And you're like, okay, I see what kind of group you might be a part of. But it's kind of hard to determine. And there's a slew of material I have not yet been able to comb through. These legislators kept almost every letter. And then there are also boxes of mostly women writing in to talk about how abortion saved their life, and in fact, James Moore says in his article that he was, he didn't want to use those. They were just too personal. And he was like, I said that, I'll leave that for somebody else. I don't feel right kind of writing about some of these very personal narratives that women are sharing about their awful abortion histories. So that's one of your questions. And the second one, I do think that they're certainly not necessarily worried about overpopulation, but now they're worried about depopulation. And so again, it's like, I don't know what the kind of, we're living in the moment. So it's kind of hard to understand, like, what, especially around some of the policies that they're passing, how you get people to a state like Iowa. Now, one of the things that they found, and I was talking about this with Adrian this morning, is that they clearly see, right, like anti-abortion stuff, not going to bring the people, right? Because they're like, Kansas, uh-oh, Ohio, right? They're like, we see some of these very conservative states and they've actually gone in and like affirmed abortion access. So like, we're not going to touch it anymore. We're going to leave it, but we will jump on our trans siblings and we will destroy them. That is the thing, right? And so they've gone, which I argue in other areas that that is a reproductive justice issue, right? That is a gender abortion is gender affirming care. And this is part of a reproductive justice issue to attack trans and non-binary people and their health care. So that's the kind of place that they're hanging their hat on. And so it's like, what vision are you building of a state? And again, it makes me think of Kathleen Bellow's work on white nationalism and Alexandra Mina Stern's recent book on the alt-right and the Proud Boys, and the idea of constructing a white utopia. What does it look like to have people migrate, right? They're like, the South is lost. There's too many people, though. We can't get it back. but what are areas where we might be able to create a haven for us? Should we look at the Northwest? So should we look at, the Dakotas? There's fascinating stuff going on there. Should we look at a place like Iowa, right? Wisconsin, Michigan, right? Despite their purplish leanings, there are folks on the fringes of some of these states that is what they're advocating for is a white utopia. So they are concerned with population, just in a different direction.
Can I follow up, Lina?
Yeah.
So I have a bunch of questions. But so on that note, there seems to be a disconnect between people who are basically replacement theorists.
Yeah.
And because the people who are, peddling that myth of white replacement, they seem to also be very aligned with the anti-abortion movement. And so I'm wondering, I guess, how you square those ideologies that would seem to be disconnected from one another, but perhaps they're not. I mean, you would know better than I, but just in terms of if people in Iowa are just saying all these Latina immigrants, we're taking away all your access to abortion, but we also don't want you to keep having babies. It's just what is the, how did they, I guess, square that politically? And I guess as a related question that maybe is just as a fellow historian, thinking about how to track this over time, what is the political trajectory of these ZPG people, right? So, because when you had a slide about them, it looked like it was a sort of bipartisan theory. There are Democrats, there are Republicans who are part of the ZPG movement. And so where do they end up going? Do they after Roe, are they just all kind of it's a dead letter, or are they just, or what happens?
People change.
Sure.
People change. One of the people that's why I'm really fascinated by this guy, Garrett Harding, because he's just he's part of the ZPG movement. And then all of a sudden he's dang it, they got it wrong. Well, we need to engage now, right? And this is in the late 1970s. We need to engage the Ben Wattenberg theory of birth dearth. So Ben Wattenberg is he's this guy writes, is part of Nixon's speech writing team. And all of a sudden turned demographer. All of a sudden he begins to write whatnot, right? It's that pivot that we all just want to do. He begins to write, he's okay, these population control people, these EPGers, they've gone too far, right? They are talking about it too willy-nilly, right? And they begin to critique Paul Ehrlich, who's trying to walk back some of his earlier kind of racial kind of discussions of it. And he begins to walk things back and he's I'm really a progressive, I'm really about the environment. And then, then there's other eugenicists and xenophobes are we now see that we're actually doing a disservice to Western civilization and white demographics. And what we see is that the people that are actually engaging in population control are the wrong people, are middle class, upper middle class white people, and they're having less children. And so what we're going to see in the 1980s, 1990s is a birth dearth. And it's 100% true. Loretta Ross is they're scared because they should be scared, because population census, right? I don't know if you guys saw 2020. It was on all the newspapers, white decline. Yeah. And so all the white supremacists are we told you again. And it's sometimes you got to be you're right for the wrong reasons, right? You're a raging racist, but you're right. Yeah. There is, and as a Latina, okay. Yeah. But so it's about that, right? It's they begin to see, and so there are people that, there are people that lean into the great replacement theory earlier than Renaud Camus of France, right? That has been a long time coming. People have been, there's a white supremacist organization called the Creativity Movement. Their guy, Ben Clausen, writes The White Man's Bible in 1973, again, Roe v. Wade. And his movement, which is a neo-Nazi white supremacist movement, begins to talk about, again, on the Southern Poverty Law Center, begins to talk about in the early 2000s, they begin to write about the great replacement theory before the great replacement. So they're like, one of the things we need to watch out for is all these like liberal governments around the world are importing immigrants from the global south. We need to think about like, and they're talking about this in the United States. They're importing Haitians and Cubans and Mexicans. And they're going to, you know, whatever, taint our, you know, white pure, you know, the notion of white purity, whatever. So there's this, you know, as you're saying, tracking change over time. Some of these people, Garrett Harding was one of those people where they begin to say, we've got to change course, right? We've got our philosophy is actually having an effect on the quote unquote wrong people. And we need to, and so my point in all of this is like, people who have been active in these movements, especially women of color and other communities of color, have been sounding alarm bells about some of these things. And oftentimes it's been white feminist organizers and white feminist academics who have been like trying to downplay some of these nefarious connections, I think, to the detriment of the movement. I think we would have a much richer, more robust, more grounded movement had people like studied NARAL more critically and looked at some of these people at the very beginning and how they, and the kinds of networks that they were creating. So like Garrett Harding is writing to academics all across the country. And it's the 19, excuse me, I keep getting the 19th century stuff. It kind of feels like that. Into the 1990s, like a lot of, like the guy who wrote, what's the name of the bell curve? Sure. Okay. Yeah. So they're like, he's writing to Garrett Hardin and he's like, Garrett Hardin, can you like preview my book? Can you like read a draft of my book? Your work has been so inspirational to me, right? So all these like racial scientists that are coming of age in the 1990s and early aughts, they're like sending Garrett Hardin their manuscripts. So like he can like tell them. And he has the time. He's like, I'll give this a cursory read. And then it's like 8 pages of his notes of like how to like, and he's like, you want to be careful not to say this, because oftentimes we're talked about as racist, but we're really not racist. And that shuts down like important conversations around what we can, he often says this, around what we can plainly see with our eyes. And thus it becomes really, this is an attack on our academic freedom, right? They're talking about that stuff like way before.
Great.
So this is
Perfect.
Venn diagram stuff. Anyway.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.